Welcome to Raytown Chop Shop.
Of all the projects we've built together over the years, our favorite, by far, is this 1961 Corvette. We started with a bare fiberglass body and a trailer full of parts. We did a complete frame-off restoration, including rebuilding the engine and painting the car using the original paint codes for the red, black, and silver. Midway through the restoration, the owner and a friend of ours stopped by to hear the original 283 fire up for the first time in over 30 years. A year and a half later, my wife Carlin and I took the first drive in this classic. Although it was a very short one. Austin and I just wish we could have kept this one.
Well, we are keeping this one. It's time for KawaBunga Part 6.
Time for the roll bar. I used a carpenter square to make sure the main roll bar was straight up and down, while Austin tacked it in place.
We measured the other side, marked the spot, and tack welded the main roll bar.
With both sides of the main roll bar in place, Austin did the final welding. Just hope we never have to find out just how good these welds really are.
We adjusted the angle of the tubing notcher for the support bars that will brace the main roll bar.
Even with the adjusted angle on the notcher, we still had to do a little bit of grinding to get the angle just right. Austin tacked the 4 support bars in place, making for a pretty solid roll cage.
We decided to use only one support bar for the steering hoop. That way, the driver would have more legroom and the steering system would be pretty solid.
Since we really extended the length of the go-kart, we decided to add one more cross member directly under the steering hoop. This should really help strengthen the entire frame. We plan to install a belly pan made out of sheet metal after we get the entire frame cleaned up and painted. My son-in-law, Keegan, stopped by one day and we talked him into being our cameraman.
Ever since we installed the rear axle, my dad has had his doubts about how the go-kart is going to turn with both rear wheels mounted solid. We're about to find out.
Alright, I want everyone to notice who's doing the driving and who's doing the pushing. I'd call this a blatant example of senior abuse. Also, keep in mind, the brake's not even hooked up.
Luckily, our front yard is a pretty steep hill, so Dad didn't have to do a lot of pushing. I tested the steering on the way down, and it looks like it's going to turn just fine.
Once you hit level ground, notice who has to do the pushing again. No way am I pushing the KawaBunga back up the hill. Time to hook up my zero-turn mower.
And we're off and running. I kept testing the steering as Dad pulled me back up the hill. Our Boxer Clio had joined us on the test run.
You'd have thought he'd let me drive the go-kart at least once, but no, once again the old man has to do the pushing. I'm really glad the steering worked, although I'm pretty sure we're going to wear out the rear tires pretty fast, since there's no differential to let one tire turn slower in a turn.
The KawaBunga is back in the shop and looking good. Since we're waiting on parts, we decided to do some work on the cosmetics. We thought the old black paint would come right off using a wire wheel attached to our side grinder.
Turns out, we were wrong. The black paint was really stubborn. After a couple of hours, we only had the front end partially stripped. We've decided to sandblast the frame after we figure out all the mechanicals.
I used an old piece of sheet metal to cut the mounting tabs for all the electrical components that used to be mounted under the seat and rear fender of the original Kawasaki. I decided to rivet the mounting tabs on instead of welding them, just in case we had to make some changes later on.
Austin fabricated a bracket to hold the fuse box on the back of the frame. Now we'll have easy access to the fuses in case we have to change one down the line.
Using a sheet of poster board, I started laying out the lines for a cover that will go over the electrical components and add a finishing touch to the bare frame of the motorcycle.
This is one of the best parts of building any project, making something from scratch to fit a need. It takes a lot of patience, experimenting, and imagination to make something completely original. Austin took his time, stopping every now and then to make sure the design was going to work the way he hoped it would.
Once I was happy with the poster board, I traced it onto the old belly pan we'd cut off the frame earlier.
Austin used the plasma cutter to cut the rear cover. Even with the thick coat of paint on the sheet metal, the plasma cutter didn't have a problem cutting through it. He's getting pretty good at cutting freehand. Wish I could say the same thing about me.
With the basic shape cut out, we used the die grinder to clean up the inside cuts on the rear cover.
We don't have a lot of fancy machines like you see on television when somebody goes to shaping metal. We basically rely on the vise, an assortment of hammers, some angle iron and round tubes, C-clamps, a hacksaw, and a lot of elbow grease. It took a while, but we finally got the rear cover bent into the basic shape we were looking for.
And here's what all the hard work looks like on the motorcycle frame. Looks like it's going to do the job just fine. Once I was sure the bends and curves were right, I welded up the seams.
The wire wheel barely made a dent removing the paint, so Austin used a chemical stripper to get the rear cover down to bare metal. And then cleaned it with a flap disc.
I wiped down the rear cover with some rubbing alcohol to get rid of any of the junk left over from stripping it. I gave it a quick coat of primer. We'll eventually paint it white to match the Kawasaki gas tank.
We needed something at the back of the rear cover to use as a mounting spot, so Austin welded a couple of pieces of metal to the back of the motorcycle frame.
I used a grinder to remove the excess metal and smooth out the welds. When we install the rear cover, we'll use self-tapping screws to attach it. During the little test drive down the hill in the front yard, I didn't like the fact that I had to turn the handlebars a lot to make the turn, so we're going to change the original steering geometry. I used the plasma cutter to make a couple of tab extensions we're going to weld to the original steering center pivot. I center punched the tabs in order to drill the holes where the bolt will go through.
By extending the center point of the steering, it doesn't take as much to turn the handlebars, and the turning radius is reduced. You can see the original bolt hole. We moved the pivot about 1.5 inches. I
tacked the extensions to the original steering center pivot. We removed the heim joints so I could make the final welds. A little grinding cleaned up the welds. We reinstalled the tie rods and gave the handlebars a turn. I didn't have to move the handlebars nearly as much as before to turn the wheels lock to lock. We did have to adjust the height on one of the spindle steering arms.
That wraps up part 6 of the KawaBunga build. Join us next time when we'll tackle the handlebar controls and wiring so we can finally take it for a test drive.
Speaking of test drives, we restored the 61 Corvette labor-free. Our only stipulation? Driving privileges. Austin even learned to drive a stick on the Corvette. Every chance we get, we borrow the Corvette from the owner, put the top down, and cruise the streets of Raytown.
Thanks for watching.